I can't believe it's already our last session. And this promises to be another very exciting session, dissolving borders between art and medicine. And really we have quite a great lineup of speakers here. I'm sure many of you know them already. Susan Stronge, who is a senior curator in the Asian department and the V&A specialist in Mughal court art, who has written, lectured and broadcast extensively on many aspects of the arts created for and collected by the Mughal emperors and their circle. And her books include Painting for the Mughal Emperor, Made for Mughal Emperors, and Tipu's Tigers. And she curated many exhibitions, including The Art of the Sikh Kingdoms in 1999, which we still remember. And when we saw the Ranjit Singh one, of course, it came to mind too. And Bejeweled Treasures, the Al-Thani collection in 2015. Now I'm going to run into more problems introducing Professor Qasim Aziz, not because of his name, but because of the disciplines in which he works. He's Professor of Neurogastroenterology and Director of the Wingate Institution of Neurogastroenterology. And his research has contributed to the understanding of the human gut-brain axis, which is something I think we've all been very aware of in recent years. And his research has employed, more big words, neurophysiological aspects and treatment of disorders of the gut-brain interaction, such as non-cardiac chest pain, acid reflux disease, and IBS. And he's performed pioneering research exploring the link between connective tissue disorders that lead to bendy joints, which I don't know what they are, and gastrointestinal symptoms. And he's obviously, for this research, has received many distinctions, including the Sir Francis Avery Jones Research Gold Medal by the British Society of Gastroenterology and the Janssen Award for Basic and Clinical Research by the American Gastroenterology Association. In fact, there were so many medals and distinctions that you'll have to look at the programme to see them all, or we'll be here for the whole talk. And the moderator today is Jonathan Kennedy, who works in government, non-profit and commercial creative sectors. And he was Director of Arts India, the British Council, from February 2019 to October 2023, where he led the Cultural Diplomacy Programme, shaping government policy on the arts and creative industries to strengthen UK and India cultural relations. Now, I'm not sure how this is all going to happen, come together, but I'm really looking forward to learning more about that. Welcome to our speaker.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think thank you to the Khushwant Singh Festival for inviting us today. It's been and the past 2 days that I've been here for, it's been an extraordinary, diverse contrast of conversations, and I can't think of anything quite so diverse as the one we're about to engage in, that is, by definition, gut health and brain and Mughal art in India. Let's see how we can knit these two together. And if we can't knit those two things together, we're still going to have a fabulous conversation around both sets of specialisms. So thank you for sticking with us as we head toward the final furlough of the festival. And I'm just going to try and make some introductory comments that bridge the gap that we're about to kind of cross over. The World Cities Culture Forum, which is a combination of 44 cities from across the world, including in India, Bengaluru, released a piece of research very recently with Historic England, and it talks around the combination of arts and heritage, the built heritage, monuments, archives, making us feel better about ourselves and the world. And in fact, the research says that 93% of us feel better and happier having visited a museum or a site of heritage. And of those 44 cities that make up the World Cities Culture Forum, 60 of them are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and they collectively make up 164,000 local heritage sites, all making us feel happier. So I think we have the V&A in many ways to thank for that, and we're going to hear more about that in terms of Mughal art. Over the course of the past 2 days, Tagore has kind of peppered some of the conversations, the kind of the Bard of Bengal, of West Bengal, and many of you, I'm sure you will know of, one of his most iconic pieces of poetry, talks of fearless minds. Where the mind is without fear, where the mind is without fear, and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where worlds come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and actions, into the heaven of freedom. My Father, let my country awake. And with that, I'm going to hand over for some awakening headspace.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Nilofer and Rahul for giving me this opportunity to speak at this prestigious Khushwant Singh Art Festival. And I have to say that I would love to see the... okay. I would love to see at this point the face of my art teacher from school, who would, whenever the exam results would come through, he would call me and actually say, Qasim, I'm only passing you because you're good at other subjects. So, okay, so here we go. So this very exciting, when I looked at the title of this talk, The Dissolving Borders Between Art and Medicine and Healing the World, when I started thinking about it, I actually said and thought to myself, well, nature is, to my mind, the greatest healer and the greatest artist as well. So how can I combine that in my talk, the healing and the artistry of nature, and bring that together? And I do that in the context of the work that I have done over the years and work that others have done. And let's see if we can weave this story together. But first of all, in honor of Khushwant Singh, I want to really go through this quotation of his when he says, when the world is itself draped in the mantle of night, the mirror of the mind is like the sky in which thoughts twinkle like stars. And I think this is said so beautifully. And the bit about the mirror of the mind is like the sky in which thoughts twinkle like the stars could inspire PhDs and books in its own right, because it also touches on this idea of mindfulness and mindful healing, which is a concept which is very prevalent in psychological medicine these days. And it's defined as mindfulness practices to promote emotional and psychological well-being. And the core principle is fostering self-awareness, compassion, and emotional resilience, all of which Khushwant Singh wrote about. So moving on from there into injury and healing. Injury can be a very physical injury when you hurt yourself on your hand or you burn yourself, and a psychological injury when you hurt yourself emotionally. But both of those injuries do heal naturally. And the role of medicine is really to facilitate and promote that healing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to take an example of physical healing, and we're going to take an example of psychological injury and healing as well. But the example that I'm going to take of physical injury is that of a stroke. In this condition, there is compromise to the blood supply of the brain, which has a devastating effect on the person. If you survive that injury, you're going to be left with significant physical defects. And those physical defects can be in the midline structures. You can't talk, you can't swallow, and then your structures, like your arms and your legs, which are bilateral on both sides, and you can't walk. So this devastating injury, over a period of time, the person starts to heal. And slowly the swallowing comes back, the speech comes back, and with the right sort of treatment, physiotherapy, etc., the physical disabilities also start to reduce. So how does this occur? When I was a PhD student, one of the projects that I got involved with was to identify the brain centers for swallowing. And this is a little technical, but not that technical. If you learned a little bit of physics in school, you'll be able to understand that if you take a magnetic pulse and generate a magnetic pulse over the brain with this coil placed over here, which is connected to a stimulator, this magnetic field that is generated by this coil will generate an electrical current in the conducting tissue of the brain inside. Basic law of Faraday, basic law of physics. That electrical current will activate the nerves going from the brain to the peripheral structures like the muscles. And the muscles will respond by creating a twitch. Okay? So now, if we create that current here, this downward electrical current, and you place a little device in the throat with this tube, which has got a couple of electrodes or devices that can measure the twitch of the muscle in the throat, the swallowing muscles, you get a picture like this. So here is the artifact caused by the stimulus, and here is the muscle twitch, and the strength of the muscle twitch can be measured by looking at the amplitude of this twitch, how large that twitch is. So now you can extrapolate that into a two-dimensional space. You can map the parts of the brain that produce that twitch and put that onto this two-dimensional space where X represents the midline. And then because you're looking at the head from the top, the left side is on your right side and vice versa. And you map which parts of the brain are producing the twitch. And you can produce based on the amplitude. So yellow represents very high amplitude or strong twitch, and blue represents a very mild or very weak twitch. And you see that the strong twitch is coming from the right side of the brain in comparison to the left, where there's very, very weak twitches, and is very close to the midline. You repeat that, this is study 1, you repeat that same study on the same subject on another occasion, and you get pretty much the same result, that swallowing is represented, these swallowing represented, our muscles are represented more on one side of the brain than on the other side of the brain. This is described as hemispheric dominance. You get that in speech, and you get that in swallowing. It seems that the midline muscles are represented on either one side or the other. And then you can extrapolate that onto a real brain to see exactly which part of the brain this signal is coming from. And just out of interest, that is actually my brain, and that's actually my profile from all those years ago when these studies was done, because I participated in these studies myself. Now let's see what happens after stroke. Now this is not my brain, but this patient had a stroke where there is a scar that is formed on this left side of the brain. And when you stimulate the left side of the brain, you do not get any activation of the swallowing muscles. However, on the right side of the brain, there is a very little small representation, which is not enough for the swallowing function to occur. So this patient cannot swallow after the stroke. But look at what happens 1 month later. There is very little regeneration of swallowing function on the damaged side, but now the undamaged side, which was not the dominant hemisphere for this patient when he first had the stroke, takes over swallowing control. So the swallowing function has improved, and the non-dominant hemisphere, the undamaged hemisphere, has taken over swallowing control, and by 3 months, the swallowing is completely normal, and the swallowing control remains on this undamaged hemisphere. So what has happened is that healing, this is nature's artistry, nature's healing, it has opened up new connections that were dormant, they were not working, but now they have started working, and they have allowed this person to actually heal. And this can happen without any medicine, anything. This recovery occurs just naturally in most people who get one side of the brain affected by the stroke. But you can facilitate this recovery. This is where the healing part of medicine comes in, by stimulating that muscle with analysis. The same electrode that we were using to record the muscle twitches, we can use that to stimulate and produce a small electrical current, which feels like a little tickle in the back of the throat. And if you do that regularly every day after a stroke, the recovery from the stroke occurs much quicker. So this sensory feedback, as we call it, going to the brain encourages recovery, and that is the concept of physiotherapy as well. We move on to the role of environment in healing. There is a great concept these days. The modern hospitals that are being developed have this concept of healing spaces, which promote comfort, tranquility, and hope. And architecture and interior design and landscaping is all being developed to be conducive to healing and to rejuvenation. So now, keep that thought of environment in your minds and think about the environment, how we judge the environment around us. And one of the ways we judge the environment around us is by looking at facial expressions of the people in our environment. So facial expressions is a very good way of judging what is happening in the environment, because if people are looking happy, you realize that this is a happy environment, you feel relaxed. If people are looking sad, you feel sad, you empathize. That's why watching a sad movie makes you feel sad. Okay? And similarly, anger and fear, if there is, everybody's looking fearful, you know that there is some danger in the environment. It allows you to react and respond to that by just looking at the facial expressions. So we asked this question in our research: can facial expressions of a negative emotion, like fear, influence the perception and brain processing of abdominal pain? So this was part of the research program that I was involved in, brain-gut axis. We were stimulating the brain and recording from the gut, and we were stimulating the gut and recording from the brain to really look at both the sides of the pathways. And this is the study we did. And again, looks technical, but I'll try and explain that. So we looked at the brain, parts of the brain that are responding to a painful stimulus in the esophagus, the gullet, the food pipe, by placing a little balloon with a tube. We place a balloon there, we inflate the balloon till the person feels pain, and we record the brain areas that are activated by that pain by using a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging. So magnetic resonance imaging is a way of looking at structure, but there is a method within it to look at function as well, by looking at changes in blood flow that occur when a part of the body is moving or there is pain coming from the body. There is more blood flow to specific parts of the brain that are getting activated. So we did this study by showing people pictures of neutral emotional faces, or neutral faces showing neutral emotion, or faces showing fearful emotion, while we were giving them a painful stimulus in the esophagus. What you see here is activation of the brain areas that respond to the painful stimulus in the esophagus due to neutral, but during fearful facial expressions, you see a marked increase in this activation. And these are areas such as the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, which are known as the limbic areas of the brain. You may have heard this expression, this person has gone limbic, meaning they've gone very emotional. So these are the emotional parts of the brain that are also involved in pain processing. And those areas became markedly increased in their activity just by looking, but just like due to the change in the facial expressions. And when we looked at the perception of pain to these two types of facial expressions, we saw that those who, when people were looking at the fearful expressions, they rated the pain as much higher than when they were looking at neutral expressions. So this slight change in environment, just the facial expression changing from a neutral to a fearful, increased the pain, increased the activity in the emotional areas of the brain that are also involved in processing pain. And others have looked at the effect of music on pain as well. And this is a meta-analysis, and I'm going to try and teach you what a meta-analysis is, where you take a number of studies that have been done in that domain. So looking at the intervention, which is music, and what is the effect of music on pain, and you have a controlled stimulus, which is not music. And you take the number of studies that have been published, which is 13 over here, and you look at this part in the middle here called the mean response, okay? So what is the mean response? And then the arms on the side is the range of response. And if that mean falls on the left side of this 0 line, that favors the intervention, which is the music. And if it falls on the right side of that, that favors the control. And as you can see, all 13 studies favor music as an intervention that reduces the intensity of pain that these people were experiencing. These authors also looked at the brain processing of pain, just like we did. And A represents the activity in the brain without any music or with the control stimulus, and B represents activity in the brain with music, and C is the difference. And what you see here is this is the insula. Insula is a very important part of the brain which integrates information from different parts of the body and is very important for pain processing. And you see that there is quite a bit of activity here which is now reduced during music. Okay, so there is damping down of the activity. One could say that this is partly due to distraction, but even if that is the case, then that is a very good way of reducing pain without giving anyone any medicines. So we come to this part of the talk now where we're talking about the brain and the gut and the brain and the body talking to one another. Okay, and this whole concept of brain-body interaction or brain-body axis or the brain-gut axis as the area that I work on is really very exciting and moves away from that Cartesian dualism that was the view that was very prevalent a couple of centuries ago. And with regard to the brain-gut axis, there was the first experiment that is considered to have been done in this area was by a surgeon called William Beaumont in the late 18th, early 19th century. He was a US Army surgeon. And he found this patient who had experienced a gunshot wound to his abdomen. And there was a gaping hole in his abdomen through which he could look into the stomach. So he commissioned this patient to work with him. He took him to his house. And all day he would do experiments on him and see what's happening in his stomach. So he would make him angry and then see what happened in his stomach and see what was going on in his stomach when he was eating and so on. And he found that the change in his patient's emotional state would lead to change in his stomach function. The stomach would suddenly start gurgling. It would become red. It would create a lot of secretions and so on. So this was the first description of brain-gut axis or brain-gut interaction. But we now know that there is a conduit of how the brain and the gut communicate with one another, and this is through the stress response system. Every one of us has the stress response system, so when there's stress in the environment, we react to that. And one of the major ways is through this autonomic nervous system. This is the nervous system of the organs of the body. And there are two parts to it. The sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight and flight nervous system, gets you ready to fight or run away, and your heart rate increases, blood flow increases, and it has an inhibitory effect on gut. When you're running away from danger, you don't want your gut to be very active at that time. And then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the major nerve here is the vagus nerve, and this is your rest and digest nervous system. So you take a deep breath and your heart rate calms down. You feel a bit calmer. And this nervous system is stimulatory for the gut. Okay. And then there are this, what was described as the HP axis, hypothalamic pituitary axis, because the pituitary secretes a hormone which goes to the adrenal glands, which are just over the kidneys, and they secrete these steroid hormones, and you need the steroids to cope with the stress. It gives you energy, the steroids. So these systems work together with one another. And then these are affected by your genes and by the type of person you are, etc., as to how much these systems will get activated. And Stephen Porges is a scientist from Chicago in the US, and he's developed this very beautiful theory called the Porges polyvagal theory. According to that, he describes that there are three states of mind in response to threat. When we're threatened, in mammals, because we have facial expressions and we can vocalize, the first thing we do is we actually try and vocalize and smile at whoever's causing us danger or fear and talk our way out of it. So that's described as this ventral vagal state because there are some nuclei in the brain that are called the ventral nuclei. This whole state is monitored through those nuclei. But if this threat level escalates and we can't get away from it by just smiling or talking our way through, then we start thinking of, oh, am I going to run away now or am I going to fight? So you get into this fight and flight state. Okay, so that's the second state that you get into. And if that doesn't work and the threat is overwhelming, that sometimes people will go into this what we call the dorsal vagal state where they just immobilize and freeze. And this happens to soldiers in war, that they will feign death by just pretending that they've been killed. But it happens when you go to your GP and the nurse comes with a syringe and wants to take blood sample from you, and you faint there. So that's again that freeze response that is occurring. But there is a lot of individual variation in the way we respond to stress, because some people go into this freeze response very quickly and others don't go into that freeze response but go into that fight and flight response. And how does that affect us day to day? We did this study where we looked at the effect of all of these factors. So we looked at anxiety, we looked at a gene called the serotonin gene, and we looked at the autonomic nervous system and the cortisol levels and so on. And we found that there were two types of people. Okay, the two clusters. We studied about 120 subjects, but only found everybody fell into either one or the other cluster. There was the extrovert cluster. So these people had low levels at baseline before they were given a painful stimulus. They had low level of anxiety. They had a certain genotype called the LL genotype of the serotonin gene. And their sympathetic tone, their fight and flight tone was low, and their parasympathetic tone was high. So they were calmer people because they were able to control their heart rate, and they had low levels of cortisol. They were less stressed. But when we gave them a painful stimulus, either giving them a nail bed pressure or blew up a balloon in the esophagus to quite severe pain, they tolerated more pain. They habituated easily to the pain. They had more now. They mounted a sympathetic response to the pain. They mounted a fight and flight response to the pain. And that led to a parasympathetic nervous system withdrawal. And they preferentially activated certain parts of the brain. And this profile was stable at 1 year. So this is when they're stressed, they go into the fight and flight mode. Then there was the neurotic cluster. Not a very nice term, neurotic, but bear with us. This is the clinical term. These were at baseline more anxious. They had this S allele of the serotonin transporter, which is more related to stress and anxiety. They were stressed at baseline. They had high sympathetic tone. Their heart rate was high. Their parasympathetic tone was less, and their cortisol levels were elevated. And when they were given pain, they tolerated less pain. They habituated less to the pain. And they had the sympathetic withdrawal and parasympathetic activation. So they went into that freeze mode very quickly. So this is the group that when stressed will freeze. Okay. And then we did some studies in our patients with chronic pain. And what we found was that they fell more into this cluster of the neurotic cluster, the cluster B, than in cluster A. So people with chronic pain tend to have more of this. And this fellow of ours, Adam Farmer, was doing this study. When he was actually giving his farewell speech, all the senior consultants, the supervisor sitting in the front row, and he just said, by the way, all of them are cluster B. That included me. So now we look at the role of the vagus nerve. We talked about the vagus is rest and digest nervous system. It helps to calm us down. And the activity of the vagus nerve can be harnessed to heal lots of conditions, anxiety and bipolar disorders, depression, panic attacks, and so on. But from my researcher's point of view, the two areas that I'm particularly interested in is its effect in inhibiting pain, and it also reduces inflammation. And I've only got time really, and I don't know how I'm doing for time, probably not very well. Okay, 1 minute, so that'll just about do okay, is the effect of the vagus on pain. And this again is a technical slide, but I'll talk you through it. So what we're looking at here is we've given the subject some acid through a tube. We put in tube, and we infuse acid in the esophagus. Okay, so all these horrible things we do to our subjects when we do these experiments. So we infuse some acid in the esophagus, and what we found is that here, if you look at it, we're measuring the pain threshold to an electrical. So not only do we give them acid, we then give them an electrical pulse in the esophagus to measure how much pain they're experiencing. And what we find is that a 15-minute acid infusion, so over this x-axis, we're looking at time and pain threshold on the y-axis or the vertical axis. So after 15 minutes of acid infusion, this is what their baseline pain threshold was. And within 15-30 minutes, the pain threshold drops, which means their esophagus becomes more pain sensitive. And it remains so till the end of the study. And while they were doing that, we asked them to do some sham breathing, which is just to count the number of breaths that they were taking. And then we asked them to do slow deep breathing. So in 30 seconds, they took 15 slow deep breaths in and out, in and out. And when they were doing the slow deep breathing task, their pain sensitivity was much higher, so much lower. So they did not experience as much pain. They did not drop their pain thresholds. So their pain tolerance improved. Just by doing slow deep breathing, they were able to control the pain. They did not sensitize to the acid that was given in the esophagus. And nowadays, there are many other ways of stimulating the vagus nerve. You can stimulate the vagus nerve through electrical pulses over the ear, because there's a branch of the vagus nerve in the ear called the auricular branch, and the vagus nerve goes through the neck, and you can actually stimulate the vagus nerve electrically, and it's been used for all sorts of conditions, including pain, nausea, anxiety, depression, epilepsy even, and so on. So this brings me to my second last slide, which is the science of wellness. So healing encompasses physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and I hope that I've been able to give you some examples of that. And we have to understand the principles of biology, psychology, holistic medicine to promote healing. And healing practices aim not only to alleviate symptoms, but also to restore balance and harmony to the individual, balance your sympathetic, parasympathetic responses, and so on. And lifestyle is critically important for that. By healthy eating, exercise, having enough sleep, and good social connections, minimize risky substances, and stress management, we can promote healing, because all of this reduces the stress and reduces this fight and flight response in us, and will eventually promote healing. And these are just some of the colleagues who were involved in some of the experiments that I've actually shown you. And these are the people who helped me to heal when I come back home all battered up by my environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Qasim. And I can see the number one fan in the audience, Ava, who's been watching on, totally intent on Papa's presentation. I have one question before we move to Susan's presentation. You talked around how we respond to patients with strokes, and how if we smile, that would actually, rather than look stressed, that would actually help the patient and how they respond to us. So something around our kind of own emotional intelligence is a kind of factor in how we can help ourselves heal and others, and music. But you also talked a little bit about the environment of hospitals and the architecture and the design. Just give us a bit more of a sense of that and how those things have changed in terms of your research informing that.
Yeah, no, so I think all of this matters, the mannerism of the doctor. You're all familiar with going to doctors and coming out feeling very happy and satisfied, and a large part of that depends on how well the doctor treats you, listens to you, empathizes with you, smiles at you. And I'll just give you an example. We used to have a senior consultant who was an expert on one condition, but all the other conditions he was past his prime and wasn't really interested in practicing the latest medicine and so on. And we as young registrars were on top of our medicine would say, what is he saying? He doesn't really understand what the latest research is on this. But the patients loved him, absolutely loved him, because he listened to every one of them. And there were rows of patients outside his outpatient office compared to the other ones who were the smarter ones, who were up to date and everything. So patients like the people who listen, who empathize, and so on. So that's clearly very important. Spaces. if you're actually I used to work at the old Royal London Hospital. If you've ever been to the old Royal London Hospital, you'll realize, where the Elephant Man used to be kept. Things didn't change since the time of the Elephant Man over there. It was a very dour, and as doctors, we didn't like going in there to, treat our patients. It wasn't a very nice environment. And now we've got the new hospital, the doctors look happier, the nurses look happier, the patients look happier. So the environment does make a huge difference as well. So, absolutely.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Susan Strong, or might you move to the lectern now, do a quick summary. Susan is the Senior Curator in Asian Department at the V&A in London and is the Chief Curator for the opening later this year Mughal Court exhibition that opens at the V&A in November. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, and I'd like to start just by thanking Niloufar, Rahul and Ejaz as well for inviting me to take part in the festival. And to start with, I just allude quickly to the theme of Heal the World with an anecdote which takes me back to a visit I made to the Brooklyn Museum in November 2002. And I went to see an exhibition of Mughal paintings done in the 1560s and 70s. And it had originated at the Freer Sackler in Washington, D.C., toured to Brooklyn, and then we were going to have it at the V&A, which is why I'd gone to see it, because I was going to be the in-house curator. Now, note the date, November 2002. 9/11 had been the previous year, and I think in the museum, in Brooklyn Museum, there was a very strong feeling that this might not be the ideal time to have an exhibition called The Adventures of Hamza, dealing with the epic adventures of a Muslim hero fighting against the infidels. However, it was a beautiful exhibition. It was beautifully installed by the curators, and it had, to me, a very, very surprising response in New York. The museum had a visitor's book, and I opened it and saw on the first page this virulently anti-Muslim rant, which you might have expected at the time. But then turning the page, comment after comment after comment was refuting the rant, but also explaining why people had gone into that exhibition. And they'd gone very specifically, they said, to learn more about Islam, because they just did not understand this trauma that had happened in New York. But also there was a profound desire to understand the arts of the Islamic world. And actually at the same time, we found in the V&A that people were coming into the Islamic Gallery, the Jamil Gallery, as a place almost of refuge and just trying to calm down and be much more contemplative. So in that sense, art was a refuge. But in a broader sense, it has an obvious healing function. But I think also it can be a source of great entertainment. So let's hope that we don't have any traumas in the background of the V&A show. Sorry, how do I change that? That one, right, sorry. Which opens on... Right, thank you. Opens on November the 9th this year. And this is actually the first public presentation about the exhibition. The press release was launched on the same day that Rishi Sunak selfishly declared the election, so it got completely overlooked. But the exhibition will deal with the golden age of Mughal art. It covers the age of Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, who you see in this picture here. And it deals with the area on the map covered by the pale yellow shading, which is the land that the Mughals knew as Hindustan, which covers present-day Afghanistan, Kashmir, Pakistan and parts of Bangladesh. And the basic thrust of the exhibition is to show the internationalism of the court, the way that the profoundly embedded traditions of Hindustan were merged with those of Iran, because the language of the court was Persian, the official language of the court. And I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience that the empire was established in 1526 when the Central Asian prince Babur seized Delhi and established a very fragile foothold in the subcontinent. He was succeeded by his son Humayun, who very quickly lost the lands and was exiled in Iran. He came back in 1555 and then died very suddenly in a fall on his library steps at night, and was succeeded by his son in 1556, Akbar, who was only 14. And that's when the story of our exhibition begins historically. In art history terms, it begins in about the 1560s, and it covers about the next 100 years. They are covered in the exhibition. So the theme of the structure of the exhibition is by reign. The contents are very multimedia, so it's not divided into the history of the art of the book, the history of jade or whatever, but these are shown as interconnected arts, and we begin with Akbar, go through to Jahangir, and then through to Shah Jahan. And then we begin with this remarkable ruler who came to power at the age of 14, embarked on a very rapid expansion of territory under the guidance of his father's general. And as the empire expanded, all the leading artisans and artists in the conquered territories were drawn into the workshops that were newly established by Akbar, but the supervisors of the workshops were often Iranians. So you get immediately a melting pot of styles and the creation of a new, extremely hybrid art, to which another ingredient was added when the Jesuit missions arrived at court from the 1580s, bringing with them European art, which was seen and fascinated the entire court, but had a profound influence also on the style of Mughal art at this period. And we begin with I survey the various workshops that were set up by Akbar, of which the most significant was the Kitabkhane, the House of Books. Now, within the Islamic tradition broadly, but certainly within the Mughal tradition, calligraphy was always seen as the greatest art, but painting was also fostered by Akbar. And so, under the guidance of two Iranian masters, artists were brought in from all over the empire to create this new style of art. And some of the manuscripts that were being produced were Persian translations of Sanskrit texts, so that everyone who was a non-Hindu could understand the basic tenets of Hinduism. And this, of course, was one of the characteristics of Akbar's reign, this universal tolerance, this respect towards all religions. And the picture in the middle is one of the ones that actually I saw in Brooklyn in 2002. This was from the first major project of the Royal House of Books, which shows vividly the coming together of two completely different traditions. You see the monster at the bottom, this Iranian div from the Art of the Book of Iran, holding up a figure which is completely Hindustani in its tradition. So at this point, you get two very obviously different traditions within one page. But gradually, the style became much more refined, and so all these books were being produced for Akbar. And of course, the great paradox of Akbar's reign is that he himself was illiterate. He couldn't read and write. But that did not mean by any stretch of the imagination that he was ignorant. He had a very highly developed memory. He had an extensive library. The contents of the library were read out to him. And he had an incredibly lively curiosity, which everyone who came to court remarked on. And we have a lot of eyewitness accounts from the Jesuits who lived in the court and commented on him at the time. The other workshops are much more difficult to represent in terms of works of art. The goldsmiths were supplying super deluxe artifacts for using the various court rituals, but incredibly little has survived. So the pieces that you'll see in the exhibition are very rare. The art market at the moment is filled with fakes, so to see authentic pieces is very unusual. And one of the highlights of this section is the dagger on the left, which comes from one of the major lenders to the exhibition from Kuwait, from the collection formed by the late Sheikh Nasser and his wife, Sheikh Hussa. And they have lent a number of very important objects, including this dagger, which is set with nearly 2,000 individual precious stones, all meticulously shaped and set into the hilt and the scabbard. And sorry, I've skipped a slide. The carpet workshops were also set up by Akbar with a specific intention that what was being produced would rival in quality the renowned carpets of Iran. And again, the supervisors are likely to be Iranians, though in this case we don't know their names. But you can see the piece on the left is completely un-Iranian in its style. It looks much more like contemporary book painting. And then the carpet on the right is from the reign of Jahangir and is a carpet that's never been seen in public before. It's from a private UK collection. It's not been seen in this country, rather. And it's enormous. It's 600 centimetres wide. Metalworking is I think, one of the great unknown traditions of the entire subcontinent. You have extraordinary metalworking skills, metallurgical techniques that are known across the subcontinent, and yet it's remarkably little studied as a field. And you see in the products of the workshops of Akbar and Jahangir this same coming together of different traditions, the Hindustani traditions and the overlay of Iranian traditions, because there were Iranian master metalworkers and designers and calligraphers all working in the imperial workshops. And for the first time, this exhibition will identify a specific school of metalworking centred on Lahore. And I just point out the piece on the right, which is actually huge. It's a ewer about that size, which is coming from the David collection in Denmark. And it was actually made in Lahore for an Armenian patron. It has Armenian inscriptions on it. And so that is a glimpse that you get of the multiculturalism of the court in the different cities of the empire. One of the things I wanted to point out also in the exhibition was the fact that each province of the empire had its own special industries, deluxe industries, which were circulating across the empire, but were also being exported to as far away as Europe. We know about the existence of these different industries from contemporary sources, but very little has survived from the 16th century in particular. The one exception is the province of Gujarat, where we know that there were industries producing wares inlaid with mother of pearl, like the shield that you see on the left, and also made entirely of mother of pearl or inlaid with ivory. And you see these in collections across Europe, particularly in Portugal, because a lot of them went to Portuguese Goa and then was sent back to Portugal from there. And the shield, it was in the collection of the Medici by 1599. So this is quite a rare piece. The next section deals with the reign of Jahangir, and the treasury of the world is a quotation coming from the diary of Sir Thomas Roe, who was the first English ambassador sent by James I of England to the Mughal court. And he was a very unimpressed type, but nevertheless was dazzled by the opulence of the court. And Jahangir, of course, came to power in his 40s. He was a formed individual who inherited a very stable, very wealthy empire. Didn't have to make the sort of military interventions and wars that his father had had. And he also was a great connoisseur of the arts, as his father had been. But he was able to embark on a rather leisurely reign, indulging his interest in architecture, his interest in painting, and his interest in different sorts of works of art. And the characteristic of his reign is the frequency with which the court moved. Now, all the Mughal emperors moved around their courts. That was part of what they did. They kept an eye on the further reaches of their empire. They travelled to embark on wars or to stamp out rebellions. Jahangir did so for the same reason, and the court was always deemed to be where the emperor was. But he also travelled in a much more leisurely way, indulging his love of hunting, but also as the court moved in these huge encampments, all the rituals of the court carried on. And we have, alluding to the royal hunt, this rare, this unique hunting coat in the V&A, which has been brought out from protection against light damage for the exhibition, and also a marble panel which was inscribed on Jahangir's orders for the garden of his son in Ahmedabad. And this was a very typical thing, that the movement of the court would be marked by architectural inscriptions. The court rituals were the reason why so many luxury artifacts were being produced in the court workshops. And out of all the rituals, the most important was Nowruz, the spring new year, when all the poets would bring out their new compositions and the artisans would bring out their most recently made works of art, and the artists would present their paintings, especially for this festival, which went on for about 2 years. And so we have here a jewelled wine decanter on the right, which is on loan from the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar, a dagger from the Altani Foundation, and the pendant from our own collection. The life at court is marked by extreme cosmopolitanism. The sort of people that were circulating in the imperial cities came from many different nations, but it's also reflected in art. And in this princely gathering, you will see depicted Venetian glass, Chinese porcelain, an Iranian carpet, and probably a Japanese table, as well as in the background Ottoman velvet. So this was a court where any luxury product almost in the world could be imported. It seemed very important to me particularly to include the role of the royal women in the exhibition, but it's actually quite difficult because they are portraits of them, or paintings which are deemed to be real portraits, are extremely rare, and we're lucky to have got this painting from the British Library, which the curators there have said very convincingly is likely to be an actual portrait, because of course the women would not be seen so much in public. And also the artifacts which are inscribed with names tend to be male names, not always, but obviously the emperors had their own personal possessions which were inscribed with their titles. So the role of these extremely powerful women who had their own commercial interests, who were politically powerful and so on, is difficult to represent, but we've done it wherever we can. Now, when we come to the reign of Shah Jahan, which is the third and final section, we are concentrating on this very distant imperial figure who projected himself through visual metaphors which allude to his title, Shah Jahan, which means in Persian, the king of the world. And there are many paintings which depict him in this role. Of course, we have to allude to the Taj Mahal, which was built after his wife died in 1631. And so we show this through a panel which is of the period, which came from Agra, was acquired by the Indian Museum in London. We only know that it was acquired in Agra. We don't know the monument from which it came, but it's of the same period as the Taj Mahal, and through 19th century architectural drawings. But it's important to note that the Taj Mahal was finished, and then there was still 20 years left of Shah Jahan's reign. So the Taj Mahal is extremely important because it sets the design that ran through all the arts throughout the reign. But a lot more was happening. And one of the things that is very noticeable is that for the first time there's a completely unified Mughal style which focuses on flowers and projects the empire as the Garden of Paradise, as a very idealized, perfect world where the contemporary famines and poverty and dirt and everything else had no place whatsoever. So this is an idealized world where the floral motifs were replicated in different media. So there might be block printed on a floor spread, or enamelled in gold. And this enamelling at this period becomes one of the great arts of the Mughal court. And of course, it was a foreign technique. It was probably learnt from European craftsmen. It doesn't have a place within the history of the subcontinent. The Mughal emperors collected rare artifacts from different parts of the world, including Chinese porcelain, which is seen in Mughal painting, but we have three very important pieces which are 14th and 15th century Ming wares, but beautifully inscribed with the emperor's titles, as you can see on the piece on the left. Shah Jahan's reign is very renowned for the production of hard stones, and we show the history of hardstone carving. Jade, of course, is a foreign material. It was imported from Khotan. And on the left is the inkpot made for Jahangir, which is on loan from the Metropolitan Museum. In the middle, one of the V&A's most famous treasures, the jade cup of Shah Jahan. But also we're including much less well-known hard stones. Rock crystal in the reign of Shah Jahan became another very great art. And the piece on the right is a view looking down into a rock crystal wine bowl. And then we've got these sensational jewels on loan from Kuwait, which illustrates the extraordinary difference between the way that precious stones are cut and shaped within the Mughal Empire, probably also in the Deccan Sultanates, compared with in the West. So the intention was always to keep the size as large as possible, which meant that the cutting would be very asymmetrical, and that's very different from a Western perspective where you try and keep everything absolutely symmetrical, and where diamond cutting treatises give you the exact proportions of the different facets that should be used, for instance, when cutting diamonds. And so we've got this section at the end. And then the final bit that you see on the way out is the legacy of the great Mughals, which is essentially the ongoing influence of the floral style of Shah Jahan's reign and how that carried on even today, right through the 18th and 19th centuries. So I do hope you will come to the exhibition. There's a book which goes with it, which should be coming out, I think, in about October, which has a brilliant historical introduction by Rajiv Kinra, a US professor of history at Northwestern University, and it has in total 12 contributors, or either in-house V&A or internationally recognised scholars. So I look forward to welcoming you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. 9th of November, the exhibition opens, and if ever there's an intoxicating presentation to want to seduce us in, that was it. Whilst I was in India, I was very lucky to work with many of the kind of crafts and makers that still actually are abundant in India, with artisans working across the country in ceramics and copperware, in brassware, in textiles, in enamelling, in rugs, in miniature painting, all of which stems from the Mughal era and is still absolutely alive and well. Before we turn to our final moment for some questions from the audience, I've just got one question for you, Susan. You're in the midst now of the final kind of preparations for the exhibition to open. Just peel back the door to give us a flavour of what that looks like as the curator.
Well, I'm in the middle of writing 200 plus text panels and labels. We have got people all over the museum who are making sure that the V&A objects, which are about a third of the exhibition, are looking their best. They're being either remounted or just given light cleans, in some cases prepared in other ways for the exhibition. One of the things that we're also doing is editing a film which picks up on the point you just made. What the inlaid mother of pearl, inlaid into wood, is a craft which seems to have disappeared. But the Aga Khan Centre in Delhi have recently recreated a canopy that was made in Gujarat and then exported to Delhi to put over the shrine in Nizamuddin. And they've had this project of recreating it, of copying it exactly so that they can exhibit it in a new museum. And they've sent footage of the whole process, which is absolutely fascinating and also highly educational, because as it's a lost craft, and it was lost by the 19th century when there were all these big surveys of the arts of the subcontinent, which described in great detail how everything was done. It's not part of that survey, so it to me was slightly mysterious as a process. But these craftsmen found somehow by the Aga Khan Trust, have recreated the canopy and given us film, which we will be showing in the exhibition next to the Gujarati wares. So I think that adds an extra dimension. But I should stress that, you know, an exhibition like this takes so many people to put on, so many different departments in the museum and so many different colleagues in the collections from which we're borrowing.
Fabulous. And just if you haven't been to Humayun's tomb and Nizamuddin, Ratish Nanda, who's the chief curator of the Aga Khan Foundation, is in fact a UK University alumnus. So lots of amazing touch points between the V&A, Aga Khan Foundation, Humayun's tomb, India, the exhibition to come. Questions from the audience? We have about 2 or 3 minutes, I think, before we need to wrap up. Any questions?
So this is a question for Qasim. I really enjoyed your talk. In the context of my father, who's 86, and he's just come back from hospital after 3 weeks of severe pneumonia. And from my perspective, you know, someone who really believes in the power of art as a healer, what would be the best form of art which you could recommend for someone like him who's presently in the healing stage?
So I think what we really need to do is to help to boost up all the natural resources of healing that he has within his body. And these stress response systems, when they get activated, they actually get activated in the short term to restore healing, to restore homeostasis, as we call it. But when they're activated over a long period of time, that's when they start causing disease. So dampening all of that down, so keeping the environment really very happy for him, and also making sure that he has plenty of sleep, rest, exercise appropriate to what he can do, and so on. Diet is very important here as well. There is a lot of concept around anti-inflammatory diets. Okay, so if you don't have too much in the way of fatty and processed foods, etc., they also promote healthy diet will promote healing. So there are a range of these type of holistic approaches that you can take. A little bit of meditation, yoga, slow deep breathing. All of those will promote natural healing, in addition to whatever else advice that he's been given, the medicines that he's been given, and so on. So all you can do in that respect is to optimize the environment that he's in. And in terms of art, I would say the music that he likes, the films that he likes to see, take him to the V&A Museum if that's possible. So all of that would be, I'm sure. So I think you have to go with what his preferences are in art, and encourage him to engage with that.
Yeah, great. In front, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Again, a question directed at you, Qasim. A lot of what you've been talking about has been about the effect of all these things, the healing effect of all these things. Intuitively, I would imagine that there's also a preventative effect. In other words, healthy people can deploy some of these things to make them, to prevent things from happening. But how much empirical evidence is there that music or whatever that you enjoy actually prevents strokes or enables you to have a higher threshold of pain and the sort of thing that you were talking about?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking about here is lifestyle medicine. Lifestyle medicine has a huge role to play in preventing strokes, high blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is not very high, because blood pressure is a major risk factor for strokes. And by lifestyle, when you have good exercise, you have good diet, etc., you reduce the risk of high blood pressure, you reduce the risk of diabetes and metabolic disorders and so on. So in that way, you can have the lifestyle can have a preventative effect on these devastating conditions, even cancer. Because if you're overweight, you're more prone to developing cancer. So I would say that the preventative part of it comes down to lifestyle. And within lifestyle measures, there is lots and lots of prospect for healing as well and prevention.
One more question, yeah, great.
Hi, this question is for you, Dr. Aziz. I've never smoked, so this is why I'm asking you this question. I'm just wondering if there's a correlation between smoking and stimulating the vagus nerve, because people generally have a smoke when they're stressed. They take a deep breath in, obviously, when they're smoking. So I'm just wondering, is it that deep breath that's giving them the stress relief, or is it the actual substance? And is it a placebo effect where they think it's a substance when it's actually the deep breathing?
Yeah. So there is the chemical within the cigarettes is the nicotine. And the vagus nerve has nicotinergic receptors, nicotine receptors. Okay, so these receptors do get activated, and the association between having a smoke and then going to the loo is because of the activation of those nicotinergic receptors. But at the same time, it also stimulates the heart, and in chronic long-term smoking, that sort of stimulatory effect on the heart rate, every time you take a cigarette, your blood pressure goes up and your heart rate goes up, can also have a negative effect. So you can have positive and negative effects, and there is an association between smoking and Crohn's disease, for instance, a terrible inflammatory condition of the gut. So more negative than positive effects of smoking, and certainly the effect on blood pressure, cholesterol, and so on of smoking is all something that would have a negative effect on the for strokes.
Okay, one more question before we get chucked off stage. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Professor Aziz if what I've experienced is being used or thought about, which is self-hypnotism. I have done this all my life. I'm in my 90th year, and my wife can confirm what I'm saying is true, that every time I've been operated on, either root canal or whatever it might be, I tell the person operating on me, don't worry, don't ask me if I'm all right, I shall fall asleep. And I use the bright light as a help. I pretend that's a sun and that I'm lying on a beach and I can hear the ripple of the waves, and I go into a self-hypnotic condition. And each person has said, well, it's amazing. We know that you were asleep because you snored. And now, I have never had pain afterwards. They give me pills against pain, like the root canal job or whatever it might be. Oh, you might have pain. Because I've hypnotized myself, I've never, ever had pain. Now, I wonder if you know about this and whether hypnotism is talked about, thought about, whether it's being used at all. If a patient can be taught how to partially put themselves into self-hypnotism.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing this up and telling us about your experiences. And I must say that you are indeed, I would actually reiterate what others have said, a very lucky man that you have this ability for self-hypnosis. I would actually blame Jonathan because he kept saying you have too many slides. So I took out the slides on hypnosis from my talk. I had a couple of slides on the effect of hypnosis on pain. There's lots of work that has been done on the effect of hypnosis on pain. You can dampen down the pain, and there are brain imaging studies which show that the brain areas that are responsible for pain can switch off, even though the intensity of the stimulus given is exactly the same with and without hypnosis, but the brain completely switches off in terms of pain. So what you experience is absolutely validated experience, and we use self-directed hypnotherapy, and it's actually also described as gut-directed hypnotherapy for the management of irritable bowel syndrome. There's a professor in Manchester, Professor Warwell, that I trained with. His entire research, published in the Lancet and some of the leading journals, is on the effect of hypnosis on gut function. And then he's published studies where we can induce stress in the patients, show that the gut goes into spasm, and then put them in a hypnotic state, and the spasm completely goes away. So there is a lot of medical literature, a lot of research to support exactly what you're saying. And again, I say, you're very lucky. I went to Peter's department to do a study on hypnosis, and they said, okay, will you volunteer as a first subject and we'll try and hypnotize you. But I was so anxious about getting hypnotized that they couldn't hypnotize me.
Fabulous.
So I'm a failed, in terms of hypnosis. Yes, all the phobias, anxiety, stress, yeah.
No,
sorry.
We
have to finish
now. Sorry.
Sorry,
we must finish.
Where can we go to find all these therapies when we need them?
There's lots of resources. I'd be happy.
Google.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to. They're available. Just have to look at the right places, but I'd be happy to talk.
We'll talk later. Yeah. Thank you for all the free medical advice, Dr. Qasim. Thank you for the art, Susan. Thank you for the Khushwant Singh for inviting us to the festival this weekend. Thanks to all of the SOAS students for helping so much as well over the past 2 days. It's not gone unnoticed. Thank you.